You know, the very word asylum, this simply means a refuge, a retreat for the ideas that were taking hold. In order to restore people to sanity, put them in an orderly, rural, structured environment, and they'll come to their senses. Get them out of the stresses and strains of the cities and the modernizing life, which is seen sometimes as the base of a lot of mental disorders, and put them back into kind of a more rural, almost like a monastery in some ways, a more structured atmosphere. And that was what the concept was.
The story of Central State Hospital starts off as the Georgia version of Enlightenment optimism, that institutions that formerly were just custodial for lunatics, epileptics, idiots in the terms of the day for Georgia, could be cured within the institution by what was called the moral therapy, which was a healing structure, good food, a beautiful location, so they're usually out of town, not in the middle of town. Urban areas weren't considered that. Structured days, and also a doctor-patient relationship in which the doctor kindly listened, administered the cure. You know, and if you took people there, you could actually, especially if they had only recently had breaks or evident symptoms, you could cure them and send them home. You know.
It was located in Midway, between Midway and Scottsboro, and that was the place where a lot of very wealthy people settled and had homes. These were the elite who weren't sure they wanted to live down here in the downtown area where there was miasmas and shootings, and they go up. When you go up to Central State, you're going up a hill, and you do to this day. When about the time you hit Dairy Queen out on Irwinton Road, it's a visible hill, and the air was a little cooler, and they considered it kind of above things. And the view, the vista back then, some of them talk about the vista from the asylum, was beautiful. You could see the Capitol building, you could look out for miles. by the end of the 19th century, you'd have a lot of black patients, but not early on. Black people aren't so subject to mental illness because they don't have any of the anxieties that attend people that are trying to make a living in the world, because we take care of them so much. We provide them with food and clothing, and they're just happy out there on the plantations, and they're well adjusted.
You know, this whole argument that slavery was a hygienic institution, that enslaved people had no thoughts for tomorrow, didn't have to worry about their families, didn't have to worry about anything, which is so preposterous. When you step even 2 seconds outside that system, as if enslaved families weren't constantly worried about being broken up, being shipped down to Georgia, being shipped out to the West, being beaten, being murdered, whatever. I mean, there's huge amounts of stress associated with slavery. But the myth then was, oh no, they had it good, we took care of them, and they should, if they have a bad time now, they just should have stayed slaves. I mean, that's really the subtext. So anything that happens brutally after Reconstruction, which lasts about a year or two, if there's any protection or hope for 40 acres and a mule, is just their fault. It's just their fault.
I mean, it was a really racist view of how we probably won't have very many black patients out here, and they didn't until they finally began to build, as you know, a black ward.
When you start from the Northeast and then let the story trickle down to Georgia, it's a fairly condescending narrative for Southerners. They're not as good, they're not as well funded, this, that, and the other. And so these northern institutions, McLean's for instance, are more prototypical in terms of the best of psychiatry, which in retrospect, over various eras, has its own quite questionable practices. But those northern, and then becoming western, but it becomes a kind of north-south thing with the elite piece up in New England and the Northeast. They don't have to deal with race because 90% or more of African Americans are in the South. I mean, free black people have been repressed in various ways in northern places, and all the native people have been forced west. So race really is a very southern preoccupation. They're very much wanting to get people well by providing structures that are seen as the best, most progressive. That part of the story is over by 1900 all across the country, because the state institutions that are built become mainly repositories for all kind of folks back in the family and back in the county that people at home didn't want to deal with or couldn't deal with because of a shifting economy. So more and more types of people, old people, alcoholics, cognitively disabled people, criminals, just kind of thrown all together there.
It just got overpopulated, and it was always the struggle and the battle they fought. Not enough people, not enough staff, not enough trained staff.
Increasingly, the superintendent's saying, we're not going to be able to cure anybody if you do this. Please don't do this. Please separate out these people more. But more and more people coming. And it's not only that the legislature says anybody in Georgia gets to come, 1877. You can come and not have to pay anything, basically. But people at home people start getting dumped too. And all across the country then, these state institutions start to become more dumping grounds.
Years ago, under antiquated laws, there were people in Central State Hospital that truly were not mentally ill. They were wards of the state. Their families had left them there.
You know, back when Central State Hospital was the only hospital, it was like, oh yeah, you went off to Central State and you like disappeared, you know, down a hole. You might come home, you might not. Doors were wide open. If, you know, it was like, if you fall down the chute that takes you to Central State, it's an uphill battle to get out. You know, you must be mentally ill, that's why you're here.
You have new medical ideas, you know, the germ theory of disease, for instance, replaces bodily humors, for instance, and that mosquitoes carry malaria. It's not miasma, the kind of swampy regions. It's not just the smell of it, it's the mosquitoes in there that can give you malaria. There are causes for things. There are germs, there are microbes, causes for disease. And public health would be a good idea, because if we address these situations, then we can create more health in the populace. So it's a very progressive form of medicine. But there also comes theories of degeneracy or degeneration, where there's certain populations that are just that way. You know, poor people, women, certain ways, certainly colored people, African Americans. It's somehow in their heredity. We're not going to say genes at that point, and it becomes eugenic by the turn of the century, and then develops into various kinds of eugenic movements. You don't want two degenerate families hooking up with each other, because then you just have this horde that's going to, this kind of panic, which was a national phenomenon too, fear of these kind of diseased and degenerate populations, highly racialized, highly gendered, all of those. Like, you just blame the people who are really suffering from a public health crisis, and you can see that in the archives. Huge rates of tuberculosis, especially in the black wards, syphilis, pellagra, which they don't know then what it is, but in the 1915, in experiments within the institution, they found out it's nutritional. So it's not heredity, it's airborne for TB in crowded conditions, it's bloodborne for syphilis, it's nutritional for pellagra. And then there's also parasites, which they have the worst infections in the black women's wards. This tendency to type people who are already, you know, you type people in hierarchies in ways that justify the people at the top of the hierarchy and vilify the people at the bottom, and make it seem some kind of natural or God-ordained thing that spending differently wouldn't really do anything about, you know, and that's a kind of continuing part of the 20th century story too. oh wow, this Southern institution, this quintessentially Southern institution, that is also somehow quintessentially American. Edward Shorter says in the 1950s, Milledgeville State Hospital was American psychiatry writ large, you know. So the impact of this institution on its citizens, both medically but also politically, you know, you could have 13,000 people up in here in the 50s being treated in ways that nobody back home would quite understand, but they knew they didn't want to do it, and they saw the effects when people came in and out. So
I'm sure that someone listening to our conversation would tell you about horror stories, and they would tell you about bad things that happened. But I think a lot of these horror stories would really not have anything to do with the caring employees that worked at Central State as much as it would be the manner of treatment that was available in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and in the 70s. You know, treatment has progressed. You don't just lock people up in padded rooms. There are different kind of treatments, different kind of medications. So, but I'm going to tell you overall, the whole environment of Central State was a family environment.
Some of the, strategies and techniques that they used increasingly in the 20th century, which became ever more scientific and actually moved away from that moral treatment towards, well, I use electric shock therapy, but other things that were more heroic, if you want, more aggressive. There was reason to fear being sent to Milledgeville. They were understaffed, there was a lot of brutality. I mean, there were just horror stories abound.
I remember as a child, younger than my teenagers, when my daddy had a case, he was a lawyer, and we had to go to Milledgeville to see a patient or about a patient. I don't remember what that was, but I can remember hearing the screams, the yells, and I hadn't thought about that in a long time, and that's just as well. But it was just a horrible experience because I must have been 11 or 12, and just to hear the screams coming from the different buildings was a shock.
It was really inhumane the way they did down there. And in the process, I come to find out that I was taking like 23 different kind of medication plus shots while I was down there. And also, I was given shock treatments. I had 25 shock treatments.
Prior to 1950s, like I said, there were very little medications available to help treat any type of psychiatric episode whatsoever. And back in those days, they used water torture in order to help to him. Electric shock therapy was something else that we used to help treat depression in a lot of people. Electroshock therapy was actually still in use when I came in the 70s. It was used a lot, mainly to treat women because of depression.
I really didn't know what shock treatment was till later on in life, that it was to help I call it burn away some of your memory, so you will not remember what has happened. But to this day, I still don't know what happened. Won't no one tell me what happened to my life at that time, and it will always be back in the back of my mind.
as a young adult, to work my way through junior college, I was an attendant on one of the wards at night. I participated in shock treatments, which are something now that is almost an evil word.
Is it barbaric? If you have someone who has shown a complete immunity from all of the psychiatric type medications or depressant type medications and it works, no, it's not barbaric. If you were to actually see it used like I have seen it used, yes, it is barbaric. It's one of those type things that for the first time it's used, you'll never ever want to see it used again because of what it actually does to the client or patient. And that continued on up into the late 70s or early 80s, and then the public generally got away from the use of ECTs simply because you can look back at one movie called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson. And when people started realizing what was going on here with electroshock and stuff along that line, it really waned, it really fell off. However, it's made a resurgence. In some cases, in refractory cases, it's starting back to being used again today. And it has actually has shown promise in the last few years. Thorazine was probably one of the greatest drugs ever invented, and you'll see a lot of psychiatrists say that Thorazine was as important to psychiatric treatment as penicillin was to the general public. And it's true, because in the 1950s you had hundreds of thousands of people locked up in institutions because they could not communicate or deal with the public. However, once Thorazine came out, then we were able to start these clients on this medication, and they were able to go out from the institution and go back into the public settings. After Thorazine, we had several other drugs, Mellaril, thioridazine, we had fluphenazine, Prolixin. We had several drugs that came out that were of great benefit. And then we had several of those drugs, like Prolixin, came out with a decanoate formula, which was a long-acting injectable, which was used for clients who were not able to take medications or refuse medications. We can inject them and make their life better.
In the 60s, that was when mental health pharmacology, I think that's the right word, was blooming. And the Thorazine and the Mellaril and the Stelazine and the Librium and half a dozen others, that they were delivered in containers of 500,000. And you brought them in on a dolly and you put them on the floor. No accountability whatsoever. And the tops of the containers you'd have to do like this to get them off. And then you'd line up your containers and you'd reach down and get a handful, and then it just, to think that the drugs that now are controlled, that people make money on, in the 500,000 count, uncontrolled.
Well, back when I first started, we used to do a lot of compounding. It was amazing. We made our own cough syrups here, which was an astronomical thing. We used to do our own ointments and compounds. In fact, some of this, we used to have some of these things about that big around that we would compound ointments in. And of course, when I first came, it was my job as the newbie to have to clean out all this stuff. So you can imagine having to clean out one of these big bowls that's got some kind of sticky stuff. It would take hours just to clean it. Now it's all commercially prepared, Is that a great thing? You damn right it's a great thing, because we ain't got to mix up no more of that stuff, which were the birds to start with. So yeah, the world of pharmacy has come unbelievably a long way since I first started, and I can't wait to see what's going to happen next.
The hospital itself had gone from being in the health department, then to the welfare department, and then back to the health department. And it was just kind of something that was well, it was just never in one place. Nobody ever took responsibility for it. And I know it was in the welfare department when we went down. And it was a horrible situation. The patients were cooking for each other. The food was not good. I can still close my eyes and smell the smell of those dormitories, especially the ones back on the back that the patients were cooking for themselves. And I remember they were cooking beans, nothing but, I guess they were pintos or reds or something like that. And the smell and the flies.
Back in those days, there was no air conditioning whatsoever. And you may have 400 or 500 clients and patients in one building. And you also have to remember, back in those days, there was nothing but cloth diapers. So all these clients had cloth diapers or underwear on. And the only activity they had every day, they would get them up, get them dressed, feed them breakfast, they'd put them in rocking chairs, and they would rock back and forth all day long. All the wings you see on the buildings now were just loaded with rocking chairs up and down the wall. Whenever you go to these buildings back then, when I first came, of course, me being a new man on thing, my job was to go around and do drug inspections of all the medication rooms around Central State, which was a very unique experience, simply because you can imagine in August and September, as hot as it is, no air conditioning, nothing but cloth diapers, the smell in these buildings was unbelievable. I grew up on a farm, so I'm used to bad smells. Nothing prepared me for what I went through back in those days. I learned the art of how to hold my breath for a tremendous amount of time while going from the bottom of the building all the way to the top and into a medication room where I could get some alcohol, pour my hands, rub it, and I would breathe because of the smell. Once you got used to it, I guess it was okay, but unfortunately I never got used to it. It was just that bad.
And in the dormitories, in the long halls, there'd just be people on the floor, some woman playing with a little doll, you know, and she thought she had her baby. I mean, the whole thing was just a miserable thing. And of course, you have to think now, there were 12,000 patients at that time. And that's 6 times bigger than Livonia, for heaven's sakes. And when you think about there being 12,000 people pinned up in those buildings, and air conditioning was, I don't remember it. It may have been some there, but I don't remember it. It was just another hot, sticky, smelly day.
And I was in Milledgeville a year. In the time that I was down there, I wouldn't have put no one in that facility myself the way it was at that time. Mm-hmm. Many things that happened. The first would be as we was having our lunch and lunch, dinner, supper, and if someone get mad with you, they would wait till you got your plate, and then they would knock it out of your hand. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't, if you was hungry, you had to pick it up and eat it. But if you wasn't hungry, you can throw it in the trash. Mm-hmm. And that happened to me several times while I was down there. And then other things that when you had a disagreement with the staff or so on there, they would put you in timeout. In other incident, if you got in an argument or a fight with some of the ladies in the ward, you would be put in isolation. And that was a padded room with only a little small mattress on the floor. And over in the corner, if you had to have your bowels or your bladder to move, it was a hole in the floor. And that's what you use for your disposal. So it was really inhumane the way they did down there.
I think at the time they had 24 doctors for 12,000 people, and that was and you know, we didn't have the medicines they have now. They had volunteers, they had nurses, they had practical nurses, they had patients taking care of patients. I mean, you know, it was a horrible situation, and so it really was something you couldn't walk away from, because you knew if you could do something, you ought to do it. So, and that was, we knew we could, and he knew he could handle it, and he came back just determined that we were going to make a difference in that. And there was so much that needed to be done. Oh, just so much. They were telling us about how there were some people there that had been there 10, 15 years, had never seen any family, had never had a present for Christmas, had never had even a tie or a handkerchief, because those people had just put them there and left them. There were people in Milledgeville that had not seen any family in 20 years. They had just brought them there and put them in Milledgeville. And they called that just the warehouse for souls that couldn't get along in the outside world. And that, of course, was just pitiful. And that's what came up with the Chapel of All Faiths and the Mayor's motorcade. You just had to explain it to them or tell them how bad it was, and most people were just glad to know what they could do to help too. I mean, you know, nobody's ever told them, why don't you send a gift to Milledgeville, or why don't we build a church for Milledgeville? Nobody'd ever suggested it, or I think it would have been done a lot beforehand. Ernie and I talked about it, but I don't think that it ever occurred to us that the mayors of every little town in Georgia would join you in anything like that. And the calls would come that first day. It was something. It really, well, you figure 159 counties, and each county's got at least 1 or 2 or 3 little towns. They bought school bus full of gifts from the whole area, you know, and they all got together, and the mayors all came. And the manufacturers who had rugs sent rugs. People who were making pants sent pants. The shops. It was just an outpouring of love. There's nothing else you can say about it.
A program that you would have assumed was always there. That there was no faith component to mental health care until my father brought it. And that almost all of the chapels that you see at the state hospital now were built during his era, because he brought faith to mental health care.
Before, it was just a basketball court, and that was it. And that's where the people didn't know whether to play basketball or go to church. That's how the Chapel of All Faiths became a reality. I never made a speech in my life until this thing came up. And then it wasn't a speech, but I could explain to them what we were trying to do, and that we needed a chapel and so forth. And of course, everybody, all religions, joined, and they made it plain it was going to be all faiths. All the preachers in the state, of course, that was something they could grab and run with, and they did. And we raised money. They raised lots of money. We're talking about $1 million. That's a lot of money when it comes in with $2 here, and every Monday or Tuesday at the mansion, he would come these little envelopes with 66 cents, 88 cents that had been taken up at the churches the Sunday before, and every church had the envelopes.
When the exodus of the professionals from Cuba started, it was well known that Dad would take doctors without credentials and put them to work at the state hospital, and put them to work in a way that they eventually could get their credentials back.
The Cuban crisis probably saved the hospital, because all the good doctors from Cuba wanted to get out so they could continue to practice and to do. I mean, they weren't going to be able to do their business in Cuba because they just wasn't Castro's way of doing it. But we had so many doctors that wanted to go to work at Milledgeville from Cuba. So then they ended up having, you know, say like a doctor for every hall, which was just so much more than they'd ever had before. But the Cuban doctors really made a difference in the way the hospital was run.
At any given time, there were probably 100 doctors, more and less at different times. When we came in '68, it was very much established. And there were some who had been here, who were not here anymore. They had done here what they meant to do, you know, get their education or their boards, and then they moved on.
They were the right price, and that they didn't have credentials, but they were great doctors. And Dad put them back to work, and Dad created a situation where they could get their credentials back. Some of them stayed, some of them didn't. But in the meantime, those that were mentally ill in the state of Georgia that were here in Milledgeville got even better care for the money.
You know, when we came to Milledgeville, specifically to Milledgeville, the community back then was all doctors and one engineer that I remember. You know, that was a nice thing for the community. You know, this was a nice community, but they had that hospital that needed doctors. So that part, definitely, you know, I know that here, CSA just really opened the doors for us. I know this is another story, but it goes with why we left. Castro and all the communists, the revolution happened. And very quickly, many people realized that their older sons were in danger of something that they didn't really, you know, what is going to happen. My brother at age 14 was actually, his school was surrounded by the militia, and they were taken to a concentration camp, like chicken coops. It was that sort of thing. And so that was very traumatic. I remember that. I was probably 6 years old, and I remember what was going on at my house. So we were branded as worms. Gusanos was the word that was used. And you know, you walk down the street, you're going to school, and other children are calling you worm because it was, you know, a bad thing. We actually came in what was part of the freedom flights. We were one of the last groups who came in those freedom flights. My father, when we got to the airport, he was told he could not leave, and he insisted that my mother, with my grandparents and 5 children, I was the oldest at the time, I was 12, that we get on the plane and come. And she didn't want to do it. You know, she was always afraid my dad would get in trouble. Because of his love for people and his church, he was always involved in something, and when he went out the door, she was always afraid he would end up in jail. We left everything behind in Cuba. And in 1966, we got on the plane and left my dad behind, like I earlier said. And that's still very vivid in my mind. You know, I remember what I wore that day, and I may not remember what I wore yesterday, but I remember what I wore that day we got on that plane and, you know, said goodbye to my dad, not knowing, you know, whether we would see him again. And he came after us about 3 days ago, and 3 days later. And then when it was time for him to be able to begin work here, you know, we drove in our old car into Milledgeville, and July the 4th, it was pretty dead. I don't remember what day of the week it was, but it was, you know, July the 4th, and I'm sure people were having their barbecues, but at the time I didn't know. But we're always just happy to be here. You know, we know that was the right thing for my parents to do for us. It was hard, it was difficult. We had everything in Cuba. I mean, we weren't rich, but we were very comfortable. And then we didn't have anything. You know, you came to the United States with nothing, whatever you were wearing. But we did fine. My dad, just because of his opportunities here, we just, you know, it's just been wonderful.
Back when I first came to work here, one of the buzzwords was decentralization. Open up all these hospitals, hospitalize people close to home so they don't get completely disrupted from their daily life. Family can come visit them. I don't know if we need 9 hospitals all over the state because it does cost a lot to run each one. If Central State Hospital had not become a, quote, dumping ground, it would have been a model. You have a state hospital and you go there for long-term care until you get stable, or acute care until you can go back in the community.
Then state administration wanted to decentralize the state hospital, wanted to operate it differently, wanted to bring new rules to it. And my father protested, and it wound up in the paper. The end result was an airplane arriving here one night or one afternoon and saying, "Doctor, get on the airplane. We're moving you." They couldn't fire him because he hadn't done anything wrong. And so he was moved to Savannah. And as a result of moving to Savannah, there was a public statement where everybody played nicey nice and said, you know, I want to be closer to the patients. When it actually devastated my father. And that he, to the day he died, he was convinced that it was the wrong decision to decentralize.
First, they said I was out here at Stevens County Hospital. They kept me in a straitjacket. I don't remember it. Then from there, they transferred me to Gainesville to the 4th floor ward, middle ward in Gainesville in Hall County. And they said, well, this is what people told me. I was there for 2 months, and from 2 months, they transferred me to Milledgeville. Then they sent me to a ward that had 12 females in one room, and all of them had carts, a little bitty cart that was be your seat and your bed, and you had to place your clothes under your bed. My family did not take no part in my mental illness. They told me that was nothing wrong with me. And I was just left alone with me and my kids. And to this day, that hurt me because my mama and daddy did not even consider to learn what was going on.
I came to Central State Hospital initially in 1971, fresh out of undergraduate school, the psychology degree from Oregon State University. And at that time, with a bachelor's degree, you could get a job as a psychology technician. So I stayed there for a year working with the mentally retarded adolescents who were mildly retarded. And if you've ever worked around mentally retarded folks, there are gradations. It's like the normal curve. And the group I worked with were just falling below the dull normal average on IQ scores. And so they were pretty much like other kids. And so I kind of wondered, well, you know, why are they here? And I'd look at the history, the stories of where they came from, rural Georgia, where folks didn't know how to deal with them, didn't have much mental health understanding. A lot of the kids would have maybe temper problems, control and impulse and so forth. But I got really interested. One of my family members said it seemed to change me when I went there, that I seemed to be a lot more depressed after I went to work there. I was trying to figure out, well, why was that? And I realized that there was this huge institution taking care of people that maybe didn't need to be there, and that at my level there wasn't much I could do as a technician. When I went off to graduate school, the MR division at the hospital was pretty pathetic. In fact, the reason I got a job there was they were hiring psychology graduates from all over the country because the AJC had done a scandalous report on the plight of the mentally retarded at Central State.
We all have read about how it was initially a benevolent effort on the part of the state, and there was this asylum movement you've probably read about where the idea was to get the poor and the disabled off the streets of the smaller urban centers and put them in a safe place. But there was apparently a period where they actually did not medicate, not restrain, not seclude, and people moved on. I wasn't around for that. By the time we were around, there was medication, seclusion, restraint, and a lot of coercive methods of trying to address the needs for the clinical approaches to people with psychiatric disabilities had become much more coercive and less individualized inside these hospitals.
You know, when I'd go to the hospitals and see people, I'd often go to what they called the treatment mall, and it was not a mall like you would think of. It was a gymnasium, and you would really have lots and lots of people walking around in just the rectangle of the gymnasium, where they would be having absolutely nothing to do.
We were one of only 2 hospitals in the state. At that time we had maybe 9 hospitals scattered around the state. One of only 2 hospitals that were not accredited. So there was a big push to get accreditation, and we did. In 1982, I think maybe, was our first year getting a 3-year cycle of accreditation. And that was sort of like, you know, a feather in our cap. You know, we're like everybody else now. We're not Central State Hospital at the back of the line. And what happened was the money wasn't there by the time we got accreditation. It didn't help.
Lois Curtis, who was with Elaine Wilson, one of the plaintiffs in the Olmstead decision, where both Lois and Elaine had spent much of their adult lives, or just maybe much of their lives since adolescence, in state mental hospitals, and wanted to get out. And the Americans with Disabilities Act was finally passed in the early 90s, and they put in calls to Atlanta Legal Aid, who answered the calls and decided to launch a suit and took it to the Supreme Court, and it got it fast-tracked. And so those Atlanta lawyers made their arguments before the Supreme Court and won Olmstead, which then said that people have the right to treatment as near or as close to home or in their home as possible. It's a constitutional right.
I saw that you got to travel to Washington, D.C. and give a painting to President Obama.
Yeah, I did. I already did. I traveled.
Can you tell me about meeting him and getting to, give him?
Well, I met him at the White Courthouse in Washington, D.C. We were standing on there 3 nights.
How long have you been doing art and painting?
Before I know Lee and Jessica and Ashley, I've been doing this art for a long time, about 3 or 4 years.
Is that just the paintings, or how did you start out doing art?
I started out because I know I was doing art in high school. When I was young, my dad, he do artwork. A bunch of people let me draw them, and they give me $3 off that picture. I draw them. I had to put it in the bank. All my art medicine work that I do, but I put them in the bank.
How did it make you feel to no longer have to live in the group home and be able to come out and live with friends and see friends?
Well, I think about my life different. It had been. And then I don't see it back, and that day I think about it. And then I sit back and have another care person. This is a nice home.
This is a very wonderful home.
I will be here before 2 years get here. After, in 1 year. Gonna be some people here 2 years, 3 years before 5 o'clock. Me, and you, and Lana, and Shay gonna know me 1 year next year. I had a birthday party. We went to the birthday party, we had salad and fish. So we ate 2 trays of that food and had a Coke and a drink. She brought me back home. And that's the day was her birthday. And then we cooked the fish on the grill. And it was nice. She brought out that fish on the grill. So we sit on that for an hour to 9 o'clock at night. It was something like you had no stoves over, no restaurant. We were sitting there and eating them chips and fish last night. About 3 plates of that fish. People eating salad and drinking beer. It was all right.
I thought society was ready to acknowledge the fact that you shouldn't stuff people in institutional settings. But the law was way behind. When the Supreme Court ultimately looked closely at the piles of facts that were accumulated in the 5 years of litigation, what they saw were 2 people, one of whom had been in and out of the hospital 60 times and one more than 30 times, and each of those times in a community type program which did not meet her needs. My perception was they were never going to get out at this point because they'd, in a sense, burned their bridges, and the services really were not, the staff were not willing to help them anymore. They were just going to stay there.
Congress made very specific historical findings that people with disabilities had often been segregated and discriminated against by being confined in institutions where everyone in the institution was essentially the same as them, which is to have a mental health disability or an intellectual disability, and that was wrong, and that the ADA was specifically passed in order to right that wrong.
Not only was the ADA now sort of prime for development and expansion to include people in institutional settings, but also there had been a long history of other kinds of litigation about psychiatric hospitals, and there was, in a way, a clear playing field, in a sense, to just focus on why are people in these institutional settings at all, and in the first place. I always remember this moment during the Supreme Court oral argument where Justice Ginsburg, who wrote the majority opinion, looked at everybody and said, looked at the state attorney general who was arguing and said, are you saying that the state has an option to serve people in a hospital as long as they get the services they need? And that is exactly the state's position, that not that they could, not that it wasn't segregation, but that it was justified segregation was the position of the state. And Justice Ginsburg's example was, would it be justified, she said, if you had a library, which is a public entity under Title II of the ADA, and you put everybody with a disability on one side, and you'd say, well, we're segregating you, yes, but that's because you need special whatever facilities in order to read your books. And the Attorney General said, yes, that would be fine. And that's when we sort of knew maybe we were going to win, because obviously the picture that presented was all wrong.
Very similar to Brown v. Board of Education, which it's often compared to, the Olmstead decision did not say states had to do it immediately. What it said was that it had to either do it immediately or it had to come up with an effective working plan with reasonably paced moving waiting lists. What Georgia did was it created a plan. It just wasn't effective. It didn't work, and it didn't have reasonably paced moving waiting lists, and it never got approved. So ultimately what it's really meant is that states have used the planning process as a way to just not really get into action until they've been forced to by further litigation or other actions.
What really made the difference was not lawyers, it was Andy Miller, and which finally brought the Department of Justice to Georgia, which finally got the settlement agreement.
Over the years, I gained a lot of sources of news and mental health, and I think it was 2006 when we started getting calls at the newspaper from employees of the hospital saying, you really need to look into this. There was a young girl who died that didn't need to die. And usually when you get, as a reporter, you get calls from employees who don't want to leave their name, don't want to leave their number, are frightened that somehow they'll be exposed, but yet are so concerned about something that's happened that you take those calls very seriously. And so we kind of started digging into all the hospitals and digging into following the trail of records and talking to as many people as we could, but also going through records, determining who died in hospitals over the 5-year period that we were looking at, and how many of those deaths could be we could determine, or other people determined, were suspicious.
I remember talking to Andy Miller for hours and saying to Andy, would you please focus on the fact that the reason there are deaths is because it's overcrowded and inadequate treatment and insufficient community services. And Andy would say, yeah, but that's not really what my editor wants to hear. And I'm just, that's just a little sidebar to show that but for his articles, right, there wouldn't have been the Department of Justice arrival in Georgia.
The reaction of people all across Georgia was such that not only gave us the idea that we had hit the mark, but also we actually got some story leads from that initial reaction. The political reaction was much less strong. That changed when the state had hired a consulting group to go out and look at some of these hospitals, and they found essentially what we found. Then the Justice Department came in, and the Justice Department's reports, again, essentially came out and said what we found, that there were not enough staffing, that these units were overcrowded, and there were things that were happening to patients that shouldn't have been happening. The Justice Department gets involved through something called CRIPA. In CRIPA, it's the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, I believe, focused traditionally on institutions. But now the thinking is it's much broader than just the walls. It's looking at, okay, what puts people in those walls and what can prevent people from having to go back to institutions. It's a new emphasis, and it is something that has pleased a lot of the advocacy groups that have been calling for this for a long time.
If anybody's talked about the Department of Justice investigation about all the suspicious deaths at state hospitals, that's when the federal government was on the verge of taking over state mental health care, until the governor and whoever up in Atlanta worked out an agreement where, no, we'll do what we need to do. So actually, I think this year, maybe for the first time in I don't know how long, funding for mental health, it's not adequate, but it's actually increased for the first time.
I think the state realizes that it's actually a financial savings as well as good in terms of a social services and social justice point of view, to have people treated before they go into crisis. And I think where government makes a financial commitment to these people who are the least of these, that's a great thing, and it's also a sea change. I think it's to the credit of the leadership of our state, to the credit of the Justice Department, that they realized we had a bad situation and we need to fix it. And the design of the fix looks good, and hopefully it'll be executed and continue to pay for. But I always thought it was a lot of it was a matter of money. And that's a matter of will, and that's about political priorities. And people with mental illness, people who have no insurance, who are poor, they don't have a great voice. And I think their voice somehow has come through a lot of advocacy work, through media coverage. I think their voices are being heard finally.
The people that are dealing with mental illness today usually are your local law enforcement people. I think that what we have done in the state of Georgia, we have deinstitutionalized people out of clinical beds, and we are slowly reinstitutionalizing them in correctional beds. 23% of the people in the Baldwin County Jail have true mental health diagnosis. The state of Georgia started sending a psychiatrist to the Baldwin County Jail to treat mentally ill inmates in our facility. And they didn't do this because they liked us. They did this pure and simply to save the state money.
The law enforcement community has always been interested in this issue because many people just cycle into their jails. I mean, one of their biggest budget items is psychotropic drugs. The percentage of people with mental illness in the jails and prisons of our state is very high.
I find this is a strange phenomenon. You lock them up or put them in a clinical bed and hold them in a institution, a clinical institution, and they will get placards and they will walk up and down the road and protest. But we have thousands in jails and prison that are being detained, that are mentally ill, that are locked up in a correctional bed, and they don't open their mouth.
Nobody wants to talk about putting people in hospitals anymore. For some reason, it doesn't bother us to put folks in jail, but nobody wants to talk about putting people in hospitals. You know, the whole idea about people coming out of institutions into the community was that there would be, you know, these resources in place, that everybody was going to live just fine in the community. And what's happened is that the jail has gradually become the new inpatient hospital. I worked in the Powell building part-time about 20 years ago, and coincidentally, because I was there then and here now, I'm taking care of some of the same people that were on my unit in the Powell building are now regular, I call them my regular customers, make regular appearances at the jail.
They closed Central State Hospital with no notice. We got a call at 11 o'clock one morning, and they said, Central State Hospital is on diversion. If you have to transport someone with a 1013, which is the title of the paper, physician's order to take people to hospital, if you have anyone with 1013s, we're on diversion here, take them to Augusta. It was done with no forethought. This went on for weeks, and I would call and say, when are you going to come off diversion? Well, we're still on diversion. And then finally, after a few months, they finally admitted what we kept hearing, and that is that they were going to close Central State Hospital.
One of the real paradoxes of the Department of Justice settlement was that it got the state to close down the hospitals a little too early, which is crazy because we want fewer hospitals. We want people to be in the community. What happened in Milledgeville was that right before we got to the settlement, you had the state basically shutting down a wing and a major wing, and not having those services and supports in the community yet. And so they were trumpeting all over that they had lowered their census, which is exactly what we wanted, but we wanted them to lower their census, or we wanted to get the individuals, the people, the supports and services they needed so that they would not return back to a crisis situation.
The people in Atlanta said that Central State Hospital was closed because of the truce with the Justice Department, and the Justice Department wanted Central State Hospital closed. I've read the agreement between the Justice Department and the state of Georgia 4 or 5 times. There's nothing anywhere in this agreement that says to close any hospital specific in this state. You've either got to have clinical bed space, or you've got to have excellent community-based programs, or you have got to have very good community-based programs, but you have to have clinical bed space. So my position is, maybe if we had community-based programs and we had clinical beds for people in crisis, maybe we would be able to take a dramatic number out of correctional beds and help them function in our society and in our community. So you can't just say, well, I'm totally against any of this. I think there's a place at the table for all of it.
The ACT team stands for Assertive Community Treatment. It's a team of providers, including nurses, counselors, substance abuse counselors, vocational specialists, peer specialists, and case managers. We work together to serve those people who have a severe and persistent mental illness and have a couple of different other things going on in their life that requires them to need our services. So they most likely are having some skills deficits in the areas of their daily living. Could be hygiene, could be housing, could be cooking and cleaning, different things like that. They also have most likely been in hospitals frequently or incarcerated frequently due to their mental health issues. And they've also either not been able to be engaged in the traditional clinic-based system, or they have not been successful in that type of system. So we go to their homes or to the community to work with them, typically daily to multiple times daily if needed. And we're also available 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to them.
Then we do a lot of telemedicine. We have laptop computers with a pad for the patient to sign consent for treatment and a television camera. And then I will be here at the office, and I will see the client over the television, over the laptop, and am able to reach out to places like Jeffersonville, Macon, Irwinton, a lot of the smaller places, to address the client's inability to have transportation to make it to Milledgeville. And I've also, myself and a nurse, have gone out in a car to actually drive to these smaller areas and do a house call to see the client. And so we bring the treatment to them rather than setting up appointments for them to come in here.
You know, a lot of our clients may be homeless, and to them, you know, coming to the office to see the doctor may not be the top priority. It may be finding safe shelter and food at that time. So we really try to overcome any obstacles to provide that treatment to them and bring it to them in any way that works for them.
We have pill minders that the staff bring out to the client with their weeks of medicine filled out already for them. We've had one client who was homeless that after him being whereabouts unknown for 3 or 4 days, we found him dumpster diving behind the Kroger's in Macon, and we're able to reconnect with him and get him his medicines. And we take the treatment to the streets. I've always sought out jobs that were a challenge to serve the sickest of the sick, and you really get to use the skills you were taught in medical school and in residency. To me, a psychiatrist not wanting to do that would be like a cardiologist not wanting to do catheter studies, or a surgeon not wanting to do transplants. You know, if you believe in your craft and believe in a sense of purpose for medicine, then you want to treat the sickest of the sick.
Tally and I have many clients who you learn over time to just totally accept and appreciate who they are with their wonderfully eccentric personalities. And they don't really need a response to that, but they do need acceptance. Like all of us, a person with a psychiatric disability has, you know, changes from day to day, month to month, year to year. The services he or she needs change. The proper term is recovery now. I mean, that's something we're all, those of us who are just advocates and not experiencing mental illness, are learning to understand all the time what that really means. I mean, it means, I think, at least this much, that you can have moments where you may not be acting exactly like everybody else, but don't we all have these moments? I mean, didn't you have one already today? And so it's during those moments where we have to learn increasingly to have a response and be sure that it isn't a segregation type response where we immediately take this person and put him or her somewhere else. Crisis stabilization and intervention. It sounds kind of like lingo to use those terms, but in real life terms, it just means prevention of reinstitutionalization by either a tuned-in peer supporter, it could be, or a case manager or a crisis team.
Now, the Permanent Supportive Housing Program is intended to serve primarily individuals who are coming from a homeless status, who have a disability, either behavioral health, mental health, substance abuse, or co-occurring disorders. The person that we initially see that sometimes come with bad hygiene, only one set of clothes, not able to take a bath, and then once we put them in a place, an apartment, with just the basic living items, how they will take just that small 4-room setting, very few items that they're starting out with, and have so much pride in keeping them clean. And it helps us over the course of time really learn that the person that we may perhaps brought from under the bridge that presented so stragglily was really not the person within. And so in many cases, actually in most cases, it is amazing how an apartment that is freshly painted, everything is new, furniture is new, can actually motivate their self-esteem and bring out the best in actually bringing back who they were once upon a time before they fell into this crisis that then took them to having to live in a place that was not meant for human habitation.
We spent a lot of time in the litigation talking about sort of where Georgia should be going, and there was definitely not a uniform opinion as to what the precise answer was. There was a pretty uniform opinion as to what the basic floor needed to be. And one of those things, I think, is what really caused people to be segregated in the institutions more than almost anything else, and that was the lack of affordable housing for people to live in. Once you've been in an institution for a long time, and you may not have any income, then to move back out in the community, you basically don't have anywhere to go. And so the state was basically just putting people in homeless shelters because they didn't have anywhere for them to go. And so you absolutely have to have stable, affordable housing for people with psychiatric disabilities in order to not have them be confined in institutions.
You know, there's several identified areas for housing right now for the mentally ill, but very few. If you read the article in the paper within the last 2 weeks, part of the DOJ settlement, 2 people were placed in Baldwin County. Well, what's the population of Baldwin County? 40,000. How many have mental illness? Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000. And so two places is better than none, but it's just a drop in the bucket.
We're moving from a more clinical procedure to one that's more peer-focused. And what that means basically is I don't have the psychology background. What I have is about 15 years of experience, having been a client at other centers, having been diagnosed as depressed about 15 years ago, having depression, clinical depression. I was hospitalized at one point for short term. And it was just a long go. And then they called me and said they were starting the peer program, and would I come and share my story and share how I had come to recovery. And when we say recovery, we usually think of substance abuse, alcohol abuse, but now we realize that recovery can also be approached into the mental health issues, that you can recover from depression, you can recover from bipolar, you can recover from other labels that we tend to give to people.
I thank God for Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network. We are pushing the priorities when they come every year. Just like this morning, they had got a form for, they send out forms to all-day program, peer center, for us to give them 10 priorities, what we want. This morning, one of them was affordable housing. Another one, medication. They said they want more CPS workers, one-on-one, because the CPS workers are consumers with mental illness and substance abuse. Because we can relate to each other. We can relate how we're going through different things in life. And in that, we is growing in our recovery. We ain't being sent back to the hospital as much as we used to.
The peer support movement is as strong in Georgia as it is anywhere, and that is where people who have experiences with their own mental illness, who have moved further on in their recovery journey, are able to then support and get paid for supporting others with mental illness. And that's been a huge success for Georgia, and one of the things that has to be part of a community program. So one of the things that Milledgeville hasn't gotten yet, but has happened in 3 places in Georgia, and I would think is a wonderful sort of option for Milledgeville, is the peer support and wellness centers. And that is a place that is run by peers, by people who have had experiences with mental illness, that has 3 different components. One is daily activities that are about wellness. They're not about treatment, and it's really about sort of what are the things that are activities you want to be part of. They're going to help your sort of wellness move forward. 2 is that they have a warm line. It's not a crisis line. They can connect you to the crisis line if need be, but it's someone to talk to if you need someone to talk to. And 3rd is they have 3 respite beds where if somebody feels like they're about to go into crisis or things are really sort of spinning out of control, they can go for a week and stay in and it's a really nice room. It's part of the peer support center, so they'll have peers that they can interact with or not as they choose, and where they can be accepted. And it has really made a difference in the 3 communities.
A lot of people misunderstand mental illness and just how common it is. The Framingham study back in the 60s and every study since then, large demographic naturalistic studies have shown 1 out of 4 people have an anxiety-based disorder, like post-traumatic stress disorder, social phobia, and obsessive-compulsive disorder, panic attacks. That's 1 out of 4. That's a lot of people. And then you have 1 out of 100 with schizophrenia, a 6% incidence of bipolar disorder, about a 20% incidence of depression, and that's a lot of people. And so it's educating people in the community to realize that, but for the grace of God, there go I. And making it so that the person who develops a mental illness is not stigmatized for the rest of their life, that recovery is possible, and that they can get on with their life.
And we have many clients that have either not returned to the hospital or on a less frequent basis. The same with being arrested and being incarcerated, either not at all or on a much less frequent basis or shorter length of stay. We've also had people that have been homeless for most of their lives or have never lived on their own that now are living in apartments. We have clients that are now working that have never been successful in working before. And then lots of just smaller day-to-day changes that really they're starting to see more of life.
We have people going where their initial problems were food, clothing, and shelter. Now they're talking about making friends, having internet access, getting a job, things that are part of the recovery model. In the past, mental health has worked from a medical model where it was illness-based, hospital-based, and now for many years the trend is to go to a recovery model where we try to do social remediation so the person is integrated back into the community. And we don't have special enclaves. We have people integrated into the community that if you didn't know they were receiving services, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart from your other neighbors. And I think that's the real goal of the recovery model and the ACT team services. Because in the past, the hospital was the biggest part of the iceberg, and now it's just the tip. And so, and having someone in a asylum sequestered from the community adds to the stigma of the mental illness. So I think we've come a long way in our understanding of mental illness and in the way we respond to clients. And so that we've turned the iceberg upside down, and now the community and the ACT team is the big part, and the hospital is just the tip.
And I think with that we will be seeing more recovery, more opportunities for recovery, and healthier and happier lives for not only the people who have a mental illness, but also their loved ones, and then the community in which they live.
We work hand in hand here primarily, most recently with our newly established ACT team. We are working to move into a new model of housing in our permanent supportive housing program that's known as Housing First. Over the years, we have traditionally housed individuals based on particular rules and regulations that we have established over the years. And one of our rules has primarily been that the person would be willing to accept our treatment first before we would seriously consider putting that individual into their apartment. Well, that is changing now. And with this Housing First model, we will actually be housing individuals regardless of whether they have accepted our services. The ACT team is a great benefit because we can send them out along with another outreach team that we utilize in Macon to give them some education if they're willing to listen about how they can have this housing first, the apartment first, and then with the intense treatment that the ACT team provides, hopefully that there will be a quick turnaround on them accepting the fact that maybe this change can be good. We also have our in-house supported employment team that works with our individuals to get them connected to employment. And of course, one of our performance outcomes in the housing program is that besides getting them in the apartment, we need to be able to move people to self-sufficiency and get them connected to mainstream resources. And income is one of the number one things. And so our supported employment is very critical partner, internal partner in helping us to do that. It's probably the one thing that keeps me doing what I do is because people can be successful. And the gratitude when you look at someone that has not always been in the place that they are now. They have lived a different life once upon a time. And because of that one circumstance in life that took them to the place of having to resort to alcohol, having to resort to drugs, or having their mind to not work as good as it once did. And then being able to provide the treatment and the services and the rehabilitation that then allows them to get back to a point of being as close as possible to the person that they once was. And after all that, they can be successful. So that's what I would say keeps me doing what I do.
One of the members of our team is a peer support specialist. Someone who has been through mental health issues themselves, has recovered and gone through additional training at the state level to be a peer support specialist. And the clients, I think, respond very well to her.
As soon as I was diagnosed, and then spent about 4 years hiding it. Didn't want anybody to know what I was going through. That was not appropriate for the place I was in my life. And then after 4 or 5 years, I no longer could keep it a secret. I had to get some help. One of the major things that happened in my life was that my father committed suicide almost 20 years ago. And that pretty much led to my start in depression. And when I think of someone that was suicidal, which was part of my daily routine, I would dwell on taking my life for about 10 years. And when I think of that person now, it seems like I'm thinking of somebody else. I barely even remember those experiences, but yet my heart tells me they're real. It was real.
First, that was a lady, her name was, well, Miss Shaw, I can't think of her first name. We was at the day program here, and she came and she said that was a program that she was going through, helping people with mental illness. And so it was kind of like a class. We had to go to a class. And after we went through this course of classes, she asked, how are you making a living? I said, well, right now I'm drawing $185 a month. AFDC, and they do give me a food stamp. I said, that's how I'm fortunate ahead. And then she said, well, have you ever decided to go for your disability? I said, what in the world is disability? So I did that. I was declined. Did it again. I was declined. For 18 times, I was denied Social Security. And she said, well, how is you making it? I said, well, I pay my rent, pay my water and gas bill, and I don't have, I might have a couple dollars back. But I said, well, I have food stamps. I have enough food stamps to get food for the month. And she, at the time, she said, well, I've been trying to find someone to come in and clean my house and iron for me. I said, well, I wouldn't mind doing it. I can do it. And she said, well, she said, do you have any transportation? I said, no, I don't have no transportation. So she said, okay, I will pick you up at a set day, and I want you to come and clean my house and wash. I said, yeah, I have to stay away from the day program. She said, well, you'll benefit from her for coming in and clean my house.
You know, first recognizing that there's a mental health issue, and that's devastating when you come to that realization. And then getting the courage to go for help, saying I need more than just a pat on the back. And then having a little bit more courage to take a step, to ask, you know, to do something a little bit more. And then often, I don't call it relapse, I call them side steps. You may have to, you know, we do go back. We do have to go, oops, I need to do that step again. So that's what I'm saying, it's not a linear process. I experienced this time, years, where I was doing so much better and doing great, and then some kind of event or something happened that would send me back a little bit, where I was like, oh, what am I doing here again? But at least this time, I knew when and how to go for help. I didn't have to wait for that. I got on the phone and said, look, I need to make an appointment.
One of my main goals in life was to become a nurse, either missionary. So I did not have my GED then. So she said, you have to go and take your GED. You have to have that GED to go enroll in any kind of school. I said, okay. The first time I went and took the GED test, I didn't pass it. I went back and I tried again and I passed it. And after I passed it, I enrolled in nursing LPN at North Georgia Tech. At first, it seemed like it was going to be hard. Even the supervisor and all that, they told me that you're going to have to work hard, you're going to have to study to go through this. And I put my life in. I said, this is what I want to do, and I got to do it. And I got to show people that I can do something. And I'm not crazy. I don't have no means in life, but I do have a means in life. So I forged ahead, and I graduated with my class. And that was in 1974.
Yeah, we're sick, but it's okay, because tell me who's not. Show me one person that's not having a bad day. Show me somebody that's not, you know, feeling a little bit down, a little crazy. You know how sometimes you just want to say, yes, I'm depressed, okay, but that's okay. That's what I have had, what I've experienced, but it is not who I am. We don't have any bipolars. We don't have schizophrenics. We don't have any depressed. You're a person who's got this thing, we don't even say suffer from it. You've got this issue, this problem that has a solution. Tell me a problem that doesn't have some sort of solution. It may take years and years sometimes to find those solutions. But when you get to it, when it hits you, and we see a lot of light bulbs come on and a lot of smiles all of a sudden go, oh, that's me. Oh, I see it now. It's clear as day. Why didn't I see that before? So we just wait patiently and continue to offer what we've got and continue to smile and find something to laugh about. And we're seeing a lot of progress, a lot of hope, and a lot of recovery.
When I go there now, sad is the word that comes to mind to me now. How did this happen? This was my home, the homes were nice little homes, and look at the difference now. This is where we grew up, and it was beautiful then, but it's not anymore.
I ride through it now and I see plywood over windows, and I see houses vacant, and there's an old Southern saying, the breath of man keeps a house alive, and when people move out of a house and close it up, it starts deteriorating. And if you ride through Central State grounds and look at the buildings, I'm almost amazed at the deterioration.
I remember thinking when I went to work there that it was like a little city. It was like a little bustling little city of its own. Now there is almost this emotional reaction when I drive through that campus of the striking difference. This feels like a ghost town. It's that sense of sadness, and that this might not be a change for the better. It's very disturbing to me to see that everything was just taken away from that institution.
If you come from Atlanta or anywhere else in Georgia, you say, I'm going to Milledgeville, they go like, oh, you're going to Milledgeville, hope they let you out, More people know that this was the home of the mental asylum than they know that it was ever the capital.
And where people make fun of that when you go somewhere, where did you grow up? In Milledgeville, the crazy house and that kind of thing. And but we, of course, didn't see it that way. And we lived on campus, so we became, just part of it. It wasn't, you didn't think about mental health as being that bad thing that, that honestly people used to think it was.
Growing up here, if you were from Milledgeville and you went anywhere in the state and you introduced yourself and you said, I'm from Milledgeville, it was always a joke. How did you get out? We grew up from childhood hearing that. The word Milledgeville meant a mental hospital. But the other people in other towns that joked with us, they didn't really understand mental illness, and the reason they didn't is because the people in their communities that had had mental ill problems, they were in Milledgeville.
Whenever you say people, you tell people, oh, I work for Central State Hospital, I was generally a laughter or a smirk or something along that line. General public just is not educated enough with the mental health system. You have seen a shift, but it's not to the degree that I would like to see. It's just not there yet.
Deinstitutionalization was premised on the assumption that people would be closer to home and there would be community care. But really the community care part never really got put in place. So deinstitutionalization becomes transinstitutionalization, where the people with mental illness are kind of shuttled between and among the new homeless shelters, because we cut all the subsidized housing, or much of it, police and jails, bridges, and hospitals, just shuffling around that way. And so in this trans-institutionalized place, the prison and the jail become the spaces where state hospitals used to be. What's the most striking and haunting to me is the number of these brick state hospital buildings that were transposed to prisons. So you have this dreadful barbed wire, glinting silver still after decades and decades there around these fences.
It was a community all of itself. There were farms all over the south side of the Central State Hospital where hundreds and hundreds of acres of beans and corn and all the things that you could eat. And those things were maintained by the patients and managed by the employees of the state hospital. It was one community, self-contained, and everybody knew each other, and it was like family. Not coming back. There are many in our community who think, well, we need to get mental health care back out there and fill up those buildings again. Not going to happen, never going to happen. Need to quit talking about it.
The average citizen is paying for mental health care, but they're paying for it in prisons and in jails, in homeless shelters. They're not paying for it where people can actually recover and become productive citizens. Actually, it's sort of a losing proposition. They're paying the bare minimum with no results. And if more money were paid for treatment's out there if you can get it. I mean, there is treatment available. There are medications. There are professionals. There are groups. There are activities, organizations. But people can't access it because of transportation or money, some of those issues. But the mentally ill do get treated. They just don't get treated well. And the average taxpayer, if they think you're saving money by not funding your local mental health center, it's, you're kind of whistling past the graveyard, because you are going to be paying for the local police, the local courts, the local jail, because that's what mentally we're winding up.
You're totally turning around an ocean liner with this, with these systematic changes in mental health care. So it will be incumbent upon our state officials and also the media, frankly, to keep track of these developments. We found that there were a lot of caring employees in these hospitals. These were people who were concerned about what was happening to the people within those hospitals. And so it will be in the hands of these people on the ground who will be a lot as to the success or failure of a particular community's mental health services.
The reality is that whether or not you think that the government should or should not provide a robust community mental health system, is that the government is going to spend a significant amount of money on mental health, whether it does it well or whether it does it poorly, because it's going to spend it in our emergency rooms, it's going to spend it in our jails and prisons.
When the deinstitutionalization happened years ago, the promise was to give them services in the community, but the funding that was supposed to go to the community services just never happened. And so now it's been turned around, and I think again, I think Georgia is going to be a case study of how to do it, and I think the state now are doing things that meeting the Justice Department's requirements, or things that haven't been done anywhere.